Hi everyone, this is Professor Hernandez and I'm using this video lecture to discuss reading response number 2. And hopefully this video will help you interpret your score better and understand how your future reading responses can be improved. Just a quick overview, this is what I'll be discussing in this video. These are the most common issues that I saw with this reading response. And they are developing circular arguments, application of the ethical approaches or the ethical standards, and also common grammar issues. Let's start with what a circular argument is, because I saw this quite a bit, and this is something you want to avoid on the future reading responses, as well as the ethics essay, which is going to be assigned later in the semester. In case you're not familiar with what a circular argument is, you can click on this link. It's going to take you to the Purdue OWL site, which is really useful. I mentioned in the video about the interview packet. If you're not familiar with the site, I highly recommend it. A circular argument is a type of logical fallacy. And if you scroll down the page here, then we can find the definition. So what a circular argument does is it just restates the argument rather than proving it. In other words, it doesn't offer sufficient evidence for the argument. So if you state your position or your opinion, and instead of providing support for that position, you just repeat yourself over and over, then that can produce a circular argument. Here's an example related to reading response number 2. So for instance, if you said something like people shouldn't lie on the resumes because it's unethical, that doesn't really explain to me how or why it's unethical or why it's wrong from a business ethics perspective. So you want to avoid doing that and instead provide evidence for your position. And of course, the evidence you provide is going to depend on the ethical approach that you used. And as I said in the last video, there's a few different approaches that can be applied to one situation. And when you're deciding which approach to use, you want to use the approach that fits best, or is going to give you the most to say, or is going to provide the strongest argument. And what I'm going to show you is how a couple of different approaches can be used for this specific topic. So let's say you use the fairness or justice approach, which many of you did. First, you want to look at the definition of that approach. So we know that the fairness or justice approach has to do with treating people equally. And the only situation in which it would be ethical to not treat people equally is if there's been some sort of standard set that could be defended. So for example, if you believe that everyone should be honest on their resume, and that's a demonstration of good business ethics, except for people in high-level positions like Scott Thompson, then that would be an example of how you could defend a certain group of people being excluded from an ethical standard. But chances are that if you use this approach, you don't believe in that. You think everyone should have to be honest on their resume, regardless of the position they're applying for. Okay, so you might have heard a little cameo by Sophia there. Anyway, so let's say you use this ethical approach, then the evidence you give for your argument is going to follow that approach. So according to the fairness or justice approach, Scott Thompson was being unfair because, let's say this affected those that applied for the position and actually did have the qualifications that he didn't, but he claimed to. So again, you don't just want to simply repeat over and over, it was unethical because it's not fair. You want to explain why it's not fair or how the fairness approach fits in. The virtues approach was also very popular, and There can be some overlap between the approaches. So for instance, with the virtues approach, we could see that fairness and honesty are both virtues. So you want to be careful when you're using, the virtues or the fairness approach, because it could be really easy to confuse them. And just make sure that whichever approach you start out by discussing, you're consistent with that and you're not going back and forth to the point where I'm not really sure which approach you're using. So let's say you apply the virtues approach. And keep in mind that we're discussing business ethics, not personal ethics, like I mentioned in the first video. So you always want to draw it back to business ethics. And one of you used this approach in your essay, and I thought you did really well with it. And this was the argument that was stated in that reading response. It is unethical from a virtues approach perspective because CEOs are leaders of the company and they should reflect their company values. The reading response this was in also mentioned that this could damage Yahoo's brand. So this is a good example of drawing it back to business ethics, because we're not just saying, from a virtues approach, this shows that he's a bad person with no virtues. We're arguing instead that CEOs have a responsibility to reflect the values of their company. And by him lying on his resume and it becoming public that he lied, that's not a good look for Yahoo. And he's not upholding the standards of a CEO. You could also go the other way or introduce the counter argument, and I believe only one of you did this. So don't feel like you always have to agree with the author. You could also argue the other side of this. So let's say you applied the utilitarian approach, which, as you know, has to do with the greatest good or what's going to benefit the most people. So in fact, you could argue that it doesn't matter that Thompson lied on his resume, because even though he lied about the degree he earned, for one, he still earned a degree. It's not like he had no education whatsoever. He just wasn't honest about the field. And regardless, you could see Yahoo's statement here that they felt he was still very successful, and under his leadership, a lot of people benefited. So this applies directly to the utilitarian approach. And what you do when you're using the utilitarian approach is you weigh the costs and the benefits. So a cost here, of course, they found out their CEO was dishonest. It's not a good look from a PR standpoint. However, what are the benefits? That he's still highly qualified. He has a track record despite not having the degree he claimed to, and he helped Yahoo and their shareholders. So one could argue that these benefits outweigh the costs, and that's how the utilitarian approach applies. Those are just some examples of how you would apply an ethical approach so that you could provide evidence for your argument rather than developing a circular argument. Lastly, I am still seeing some grammar issues. There was a lot of improvement between the first and second reading response, which is really good to see. However, if I did make a comment on your reading response that grammar is still an area you can improve, I highly recommend that you meet with a writing tutor at the LRC and talk to them about the specific issues that were identified in your essay. So again, make sure you're avoiding use of the second person, especially when we move on to the ethics essay, which is longer and more formal. You don't want to do that. There are also many sentence structure issues. So the most common are sentence fragments and run-ons. If I commented that you need to work on sentence structure, then what you can do is meet with the right consultant, show them your essay, and they'll be able to help you with specific sentences that you've written. Also spelling, I know that these assignments aren't research papers, but in the instructions I tell you, you should still think of these as mini formal essays and proofread, check your spelling, and make sure that the grammar in your reading response is relatively good, otherwise it's going to affect your score. So that's all for now. As always, if you have any questions about this reading response or any other assignments, you can send me a message on Canvas or post your question in the Q&A forum. So good luck with the future reading responses as well as the ethics essay, and I'll be posting another video soon.